Understanding homeostasis means that there has to be proper regulation and integration of these mechanisms to control homeostasis, or milieu intérieur. And this regulation actually exists at all levels of organization. That means within cells down to the molecular level. We have control over genes, and there are controls that regulate when genes are turned on. These are called operons. There are even proteins that can go back and shut down genes by targeting our operons. We even have proteins that can regulate transcription factors. Everything, everything. There is regulation at all levels. This can be more macroscopic when we talk about tissues. A tissue is a collection of cells that have a common function. Cells in a tissue can actually release chemical signals called autocoids that will act on the same cell that released it, or paracrine chemical signals that will target adjacent cells within the tissue and tell them to change their physiology. We even can get even more macroscopic when we talk about organs and organ systems. We will definitely see a communication to regulate pH between the kidneys and the lungs, for example. So we can have regulation between organ systems. It's truly remarkable, and there is a lot to study in this class regarding this regulation. Each body system has a job to do to maintain homeostasis. Some of these are easier to wrap your mind around to understand how they do that versus others. And we will target all of these systems as we go through the semester. Just to highlight a few, clearly the renal system, we think of the kidneys and the bladder and the ureters. Clearly, we think of the kidneys filtering the plasma and removing waste products and eliminating them through urine, and the bladder then, when it's socially acceptable, expels that urine. And there goes the waste products like urea, uric acid, and creatinine, just to name three major ones. The respiratory system, we think of that as maintaining our oxygen levels and CO2 levels. That's not all that the lungs do. They are truly remarkable and also regulate a lot of our pH issues in our body. Cardiovascular, well, that's not hard. We think of the heart as a pump to push the blood out of the heart, and then the blood vessels are a conduit through which the blood can reach the tissues to deposit nutrients and oxygen and collect CO2 and other waste products from tissues. The GI tract and accessory organs like the liver and pancreas help us to digest the food that we ingest and absorb the nutrients into the bloodstream, which in turn can deliver them to the tissues. Musculoskeletal system, how does that help maintain a stable internal environment? All these other organ systems that I just went through help maintain oxygen levels, waste levels, distribute nutrients to tissues, and pick up waste products. How does the musculoskeletal system help with the maintenance of a stable internal environment? Well, without your musculoskeletal system, how could you walk to the refrigerator to get the food you ingest? How could you walk to the toilet to eliminate the waste from your body? You need the musculoskeletal system to seek out these resources. And then clearly the nervous system and the endocrine system oversee all of the activities of these other organ systems we just highlighted. They help regulate all of these bodily functions. But the nervous system and endocrine system, while they do have a lot of parallels between them, they do also have very different functions in the body. And let's talk about that. The nervous system uses chemical signals to target the target cells. So that's a parallel to the endocrine system as well. the endocrine system uses chemical signals as well. Both of these systems have target cells. The definition of a target cell is basically a cell that can respond to these chemical signals. Now, how they're different is that the chemical signals used by the nervous system, those are called neurotransmitters. And in the endocrine system, we call them hormones. But they both have a chemical signal, and they both have target cells. And a target cell, again, is something that has the ability to respond to these chemical signals. Some other differences between these two is the speed in which they work. The nervous system is very quick to respond, but the endocrine system is a little bit slower. It can take seconds to minutes to days to target its target cells. Now, some of you might think that seconds is pretty fast, but it's not as fast as a neuron, which can fire in as little as 1 millisecond. Another difference between the two is the nervous system has to have a direct synapse, a direct communication with its target cell. That would be like me, unless I'm in front of you, touching you, saying, hey, do your homework, and shaking you. That's like the nervous system, a direct contact. Some of you can be target cells that respond to the endocrine system, where you just hearing my voice over this YouTube video is enough to get you to respond and look at your homework packet. I don't have to have a physical contact with you. So the nervous system, again, has a direct synapse or contact with the target cell. The endocrine system releases its chemical signal into the bloodstream, which can migrate throughout the entire organism and target very, very far target cells. The nervous system is quick to respond, but it's also quick to shut down. It doesn't last very long. It quickly stops. The endocrine system can have long-lasting effects, days, weeks, even months. And we'll talk about some hormones in the endocrine system in this unit that can last for months, most notably cortisol. And you are the best example of that. Being in human physiology, 16 weeks, that's about 4 months. From here on out, you're going to be oozing with cortisol, a stress hormone, and it will have long-lasting effects, most notably weight gain. We call it affectionately physiology 15, meaning you're going to gain about 15 pounds in this course as you go through the next 4 months. It's a real thing, just like freshman 15, we call it physiology 15. There's a price for homeostasis. We will see throughout the semester that there is usually not just one feedback mechanism. There's not just one feedback loop. If we're talking about negative feedback mechanisms, sometimes we'll see more than one launched in order to maintain homeostasis of a particular variable. Some of these feedback mechanisms can work together, that means synergistically, or they can actually be antagonistic to each other. And that's where it gets a little complicated, and you need to trust me to do my job to help iron out these wrinkles. These feedback mechanisms, if they work together, they can be on at the same time, used at the same time. And that applies also for the ones that are antagonistic. They can be used at the same time. An example of that would be hormones that are released like insulin and cortisol and epinephrine. These have very different effects on glucose, and we'll learn that when we get into our endocrine system very shortly. These feedback mechanisms that are launched together, that work together, we say that's redundancy. It's like a safety mechanism. You're launching more than one in case one fails. And we learned about this through, I have on the screen here, KO for knockout mice. We learned these redundancies from deleting genes in mice. That's what we call knockout. So we take out the gene, And then we basically look at the mice that are born in a litter and say, as a scientist, what's going to happen now? How are they going to die? Are they going to thrive? And what we realize is that when they don't die and they thrive, that's when we know that there's a contingency plan, if you will. There's a backup plan. So with all this, I want you to know that there's a hierarchy of loops. There might be some feedback mechanisms that are used first. There are quote-unquote go-to. This is the one we use the most, but that there may be a backup plan. And there can even be competition between them, even like to go back to the antagonistic ones. They're going to compete against each other. And students get nervous over this and say, okay, Kara, which one's going to win? Which one's going to have the most control over the body in this situation? And I'm just going to look at you and smile and say, it can get pretty messy, I'm not going to lie. One particular example that I love to hate, I mean, it is such a complicated loop, is potassium. And with that comes pH balance. And I'm going to give you just a little sample of that when we get to Unit 4. Not now, because all of you will drop the class if I started with potassium regulation right now. So what is the price of maintaining homeostasis? Clearly, with all these feedback mechanisms, there has to be a price for it all. How do you pay for it? What's the currency? Well, energy is the price. It's not money, energy. It takes ATP, cellular energy. ATP is the price. It takes a lot of ATP in order to maintain a stable internal environment. And I need you to hear that our variables are not at equilibrium. When I say that they're at a stable internal environment, when I say that they are stable and within set point, that does not mean equilibrium. It means a steady state. Let me give you an example. Potassium is most abundantly found inside the cell. Sodium is most abundantly found outside of the cell in extracellular fluid. Clearly, these two ions are not at equilibrium. We do not have equal amounts of sodium in and out of the cell. We do not have equal amounts of potassium in and outside of the cell. We have to maintain higher sodium concentration outside of the cell and potassium at a higher concentration inside of the cell. That's our set point. It's not equilibrium, but that's our steady state. And in order to maintain sodium high outside of the cell, potassium high inside of the cell, we use ATP to fund a sodium-potassium ATPase, which exchanges 3 sodium out of the cell for every 2 potassium that's pushed into the cell. It creates, the sodium-potassium ATPase creates these gradients. And in order to create a gradient, it requires a lot of energy, ATP. Now, you heard me say earlier that we are not locked at our set points. We're not. If you look down here at the bottom, you're seeing that we're constantly migrating between, just to use thermoregulation as an example, we're constantly hovering around our set point of 37 degrees Celsius. But that doesn't mean we're locked at it. We get too warm, then we cool down. We get too cool, then we warm up. We get too warm, we cool down. We get too cool, we warm up. We're constantly hovering around this set point, which is what I said earlier. We're not locked at our set point. We're never at the set point. We're constantly deviating and we're migrating back toward the set point, but then we can undershoot and overshoot. If you look at this top graph up here, where I'm showing you atmospheric temperature related to body temperature, you can see that there is a phase in this body temperature curve where it's pretty linear. And that means despite very different ambient temperatures, from almost 50 degrees Fahrenheit to almost 120 degrees Fahrenheit, you can maintain relatively a pretty stable body temperature despite those huge changes in the temperature of the environment around you. That is because you have some really good feedback mechanisms to correct your body temperature to maintain it in a stable range. And that's really important, again, to go back to preventing denaturation of your proteins. Now, are you a poikilotherm or a homeotherm? Poikilotherms are organisms that cannot regulate their own body temperature. They can't keep it at a stable temperature, like the graph I showed you on the previous slide. An example of this would be tortoises and lizards and snakes. We think of these reptiles coming out in the early morning. They seek out sun and they'll just sit there. I'm sure many of you have been on a hike and you came across a snake that was across the trail, and as you carefully approached it, the snake didn't move. That's because it's a poikilotherm. It's probably early in the morning, and it was seeking out the sun to take in the sun's radiation, the heat from it, to warm up, to get its body systems revved up. So they have to take in the sun, the heat, in order for them to do their job throughout the day and forage for food. You're a homeotherm. That means you don't have to go out in the sun early in the morning to heat up in order to function for the rest of the day. You regulate your own body temperature. And again, that's a huge difference between these organisms. Your body temperature, though, can fluctuate. Of course it does. It depends on the time of the day. Your body temperature is lowest in the early morning hours and is usually highest in the late afternoon. Clearly, your body temperature elevates when you have more physical activity, right? You have muscle contraction, and muscle contraction requires ATP. And when ATP is hydrolyzed into ADP and inorganic phosphate, some of that energy is lost in the form of heat. If you are female and are menstruating, we can actually monitor your body temperature, and we know it elevates shortly around ovulation, and that's why some women use that as a form of birth control, although it's not very reliable. And your age also. Newborns are more like lizards, and let's be honest, they kind of look like a lizard when they're born, poikilotherms. Their hypothalamus, which is the part of the brain that regulates body temperature, is immature and doesn't do a good job of it. They don't have a good shivering response or sweating response. And that's why we really have to be very mindful of infants in extreme environmental temperatures, because they don't have this ability to regulate their body temperature very well. And another issue is that infants have a greater surface to mass ratio, right? They have a lot of folds and a lot of skin and a huge head. So they have a lot of surface area to lose body heat to the environment. And that's why it's important to keep them all wrapped up. Ways we lose heat. Now, the title of this slide is very deceptive. You will read this title and say ways we lose heat, but I want you to know we can also say ways we gain heat. A lot of these things that I'm going to go through can be ways we gain heat. So be very mindful of the title of this. If you were to sit naked on a bench in a room that's isolated from the environment, how would you lose heat? Well, most of the way you lose heat is through radiative heat loss, radiation. This is you emitting a type of energy, infrared heat waves. So infrared is out of our visible spectrum. I'm sure many of you have seen the movie Predator, and the organism in that movie was able to find the human prey because humans emit this infrared heat wave, and the organism that was preying upon the humans could see that infrared energy. We clearly have um, goggles, cameras that can detect infrared heat waves. And the military uses this to see maybe people hiding in the darkness that are ready to ambush them. So it is basically you trying to heat up your surrounding objects. Have you ever walked into a room where there aren't a lot of people? Maybe the vent into the room is closed and you feel a chill. That's you losing heat trying to warm up the walls in the room. What about conduction and convection? You need to be careful with these. Conduction means you have a physical contact with something, a physical contact. Now, most textbooks get this very, very wrong, and even websites. Most textbooks say conduction is a physical contact with a solid object where you transfer your heat to that solid object. For example, if you were to put your hand on your desk right now, it would feel cool to the touch. That's you physically transferring heat to that desk. But it does not actually have to be a solid object. If you are surrounded by air, which you are in physical contact with air. And so you have a conductive heat loss with air around you. You are physically touching it. Similarly, you can be immersed in water and you are in a physical contact with water. So again, it does not have to be a solid object, and I'm very particular about this on testing purposes, so make sure you get this. Convection is like an air current. All right, so if you heat the air immediately around your person, that air warms up. And what does warm air do? It rises. Well, then what replaces it? Cooler air. And now you are in physical contact with cooler air, and you repeat the process all over again. So between conduction and convection to air, if we're using air as an example, you can lose 18% of your body heat. So we have conduction to air, roughly 15%, and as shown here in the picture, if you're sitting on an object in this room naked, you're going to transfer some of your heat to that physical object, that solid object, and that's about 3%. So between the two, it's about 18%. Evaporation is you having some heat loss through your skin. This is called insensible evaporation. It's basically you sweating. Now, you might not be sweating profusely right now, but you are losing some heat through your dermis, through your cutaneous membranes and mucous membranes, and that's evaporative heat loss. And it's pretty remarkable, about 22%. This can increase if you're working out, right? And then you start to increase your sweat production.